you come back?
I found tracks, and they were huge.
I'm not frightened by a bear.
I don't think it was a bear. I don't know what it was. I've never seen anything like it. It skinned and gutted a snake.
Well, whatever it was, we're in the cat's den now. We have to deal with it first. Come on.
The lion won't think that we're hunting in here. It'll think it's hunting us. We get some bait and climb up and wait for it.
A hunter doesn't wait. He hunts. We could be here all night.
We could stalk the forest all night and not find anything, too.
If you're too afraid to hunt, go back to camp where you belong.
We'll try it out his way. We'll bait it, then I'll lead the cat to you. Wait. It's time, Naru. You cut them, yeah? When the lion comes, you tell that thing, this is as far as you go. No more. This is it.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequel, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 268, Prey. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, welcome to Verbal Diorama. Whether you are a brand new listener to this podcast, whether you are a regular returning listener, welcome back. If you are a regular returning listener, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I am, as always, delighted to have you here for the history and legacy of Prey, especially considering last episode was on Predator. So this is kind of the natural evolution of Verbal Diorama episodes, except technically it's a devolution because we are doing a prequel. We're not doing the sequel, we're doing the prequel. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who listens to this podcast and has continued to listen to and support this podcast over the last 5 years. It genuinely means so much to me that people continue to listen. It means so much that people have reached out to me in recent weeks saying how much they enjoy what I do. It really honestly gives me the biggest boost to know that people, A, are actually listening to me talk on a podcast. I still find that completely crazy. But also, people are actually taking the time to reach out and just kind of say how much they're enjoying what I do and that they were recently introduced to the podcast and they've started to listen to older episodes. And it's lovely to hear from people. So please, if you do want to get in touch, it honestly makes my day to hear from anyone who listens to this podcast. I'll put the contact information at the end of the episode and it's in the show notes too, as I always do. But please feel free to get in touch, especially to talk about this particular movie, because, spoiler alert, I love Prey. What I also love is the most recent episodes of this podcast. So thank you for your lovely comments on Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and also for Predator as well. Predator has really come out of nowhere because it's actually ended up having the second biggest debut of any episode this year. And by debut, I basically mean first day numbers, first day downloads, first day listens. Now, the biggest episode in that regard this year was episode 250, which was Back to the Future, which makes a lot of sense because it's the 250th episode and it was on Back to the Future. But Predator wasn't that far behind Back to the Future, which kind of blows my mind a little bit, considering the sort of episodes that I have actually put out. Not even Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan could get anywhere close to the numbers that Predator did, which is amazing, really, if you think about it. So yes, thank you for all of the lovely feedback, the comments, everything about Predator. I loved doing that episode last week. And there was only one movie I wanted to do after Predator. Only one. And it was a movie that I fell in love with the first time I saw it for its simple, quiet confidence. But now that I've done this episode, I love it even more. Here's the trailer for Prey.
Why do you want to hunt? Because you all think that I can't. I saw a sign in the sky. I'm ready. Maui, Nita. There's something out there. I'm coming with you.
You can't.
I'm trying to protect you.
Protect me from what? It's time.
It knows how to hunt. I know how to survive. Whatever did this, I can kill it.
In 1719, in the Great Plains, Naru, a young Comanche woman trained as a healer, dreams of becoming a great hunter like her brother Tabe. While trekking deer, she witnesses strange lights in the sky, which she believes to be a thunderbird and a sign that she is ready to become a hunter. But this is actually a predator dropship. Like the predators and prey of nature, Naru is stalked by an effective and deadly creature that only kills for sport, and names it Mupitsi after Pia Mupitsi, a monster in Comanche folklore that eats bad children. She must use all her skills and smarts to defeat the ultimate predator. Let's run through the cast. We have Amber Midthunder as Naru, Dakota Beavers as Tabe, Dane DeLiegro as the feral predator, Michelle Thrush as Aruka, Julian Black Antelope as Chief Kahetu, Stormy Kip as Wasapi, Mike Patterson as Big Beard, Bennett Taylor as Raphael Adolini, and Coco as Sari. Obviously, brief disclaimer before I continue, I will always endeavour to try to pronounce things correctly, but apologies if I mispronounce anything in this episode. Prey has a screenplay by Patrick Aison, a story by Patrick Aison and Dan Trachtenberg, was directed by Dan Trachtenberg and based on characters created by Jim Thomas and John Thomas. Because if you have Predator, you also have to have Prey, right? And I know there will be unhappy people out there that Predator 2 isn't here instead. But honestly, there's nothing to say it won't be back later, and there's just so much more to say about Prey. This is a movie that came out of nowhere, more or less. Is easily the best Predator movie? Yeah, I said what I said. And it's a period movie featuring a female lead, an indigenous female lead, in a movie that takes its time to not only be canonically accurate to Predator lore, while also being its own independent thing, it also takes its time to be reasonably historically accurate. But this is a sci-fi film about an alien landing in 18th century America, so technically, it doesn't need to be. So the fact that it is, I love it. It's astonishing. Oftentimes, the word prequel drives fear into our hearts. What can a prequel tell us about a world we think we already know? How can a prequel justify its own existence? Especially when 4 or 6 movies have come before it, with varying degrees of justification for their own existence, except for the last episode on Predator, because that was technically the one that started it all. Prey stands on its own, not because of its links to Predator, but despite them. And that's because it never really started out as a prequel to Predator. But the Predator just happened to fit into this narrative of a person trying to prove themselves against a seemingly impossible opponent. The idea of it being the ultimate underdog story led to Native Americans, the gender dynamics of certain tribes, and avoiding the cliched representations of Native Americans in westerns also set during that time period. It was an opportunity to right the wrongs when it came to Indigenous representation, and the Comanche have been at the forefront of negative representation in cinema. Frequently portrayed in westerns like The Searchers as brutal and barbarian, as well as hyper-masculine. They'd also often be portrayed by actors in brownface or actors claiming they were of Indigenous descent, like Johnny Depp did when he was cast in The Lone Ranger. Prey would set all of this right. It's worth adding that Depp technically was recognised as an honorary Comanche by a Comanche chairman after he was adopted into the family of LaDonna Harris, president and founder of Americans for Indian Opportunity in 2012. So he technically is Comanche now, but he wasn't when he was cast. I never did finish watching The Lone Ranger though, so maybe I need to finish watching that. It was during production of The Predator when Dan Trachtenberg, fresh off working on The Boys and his directorial debut 10 Cloverfield Lane, which I still also have not seen, but I should, presented his original idea with writer Patrick Aison to Predator producer John Davis as separate to the Predator IP, but it became quickly apparent that the inclusion of the IP made the idea better. Emma Watts, 20th Century Studios production president, fast-tracked it into development, but there was an incredible amount of secrecy behind it. Now, this was all before Disney bought 20th Century Fox, purchasing its assets in March 2019. And during the acquisition and after a few box office failures, including Dark Phoenix and Stuber, Disney halted development on several Fox projects. They closed down Fox 2000 Pictures and Blue Sky Studios, rebranded previous Fox studios to 20th Century Studios and Searchlight Pictures, and prioritised development of franchise material. Now, thankfully, Prey was technically one of those movies, but at the time, it was internally referred to as Skulls. Dan Trachtenberg chose the Comanche as the central tribe because he considered them the most fierce warriors to walk the continent, and they were also incredibly innovative. He wanted to portray them as the heroes instead of their usual portrayal as sidekicks or villains. Despite not being of Native American descent himself, he knew that in order to make this movie as authentic as possible, they would have to involve the native communities and get the blessings of Indigenous and First Peoples, as well as their extensive knowledge and experiences. And producer Jhane Myers was approached as a woman of Comanche and Blackfeet American descent. Myers read Patrick Aison's script and loved that it was a Comanche woman front and centre, as well as being a huge fan of the 1987 original movie. Native American men may be often represented in Hollywood as being inhumane and villainous, but Native American women, when they are featured in film, are usually hyper-sexualised or just silent and subservient. And almost always the white saviour tropes come into play. See Pocahontas as probably the best example of this. And the Comanche Nation, those who reside on Comanche land around southwestern Oklahoma, only has around 17,000 enrolled members, with other Comanche descendants across the US numbering a total of just over 28,000 people. Enrolled members must have at least one Comanche great-grandparent to qualify for membership, and many of these people learned English as a first language rather than the Comanche language. It makes it even more astonishing when you come to the Comanche dub of this movie, but I'm going to come back to that. Most native languages were effectively outlawed in the US in the early 19th century. Children were often punished for speaking their native language in schools, and many grew up not speaking their native language and only knowing English. so many native languages effectively died. Some could only be spoken and not written, or vice versa. Comanche is classified as severely endangered by the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, as it's only spoken by the oldest generations. As of 2022, there are fewer than 10 fluent native speakers of Comanche, which makes it even more incredible that we got a Comanche dub of this movie, because it's more important than ever to preserve this language. Jhane Myers was instrumental on the authenticity and representation of the Comanche in Prey, as well as ensuring that a variety of roles, both in front and behind the camera, were First Nations people. They had an intern program, meaning that many of the people on this movie got their first opportunity to work on a film set, including second build actor Dakota Beavers as Naru's brother Tabe. This was his first ever film role. Native Americans of all ages participated, but the greatest contributions often came from community elders, who advised not only on language and specific tribal culture in 18th century Great Plains, but even on culturally appropriate character names. Naru, for example, means fight, and Sari is actually Comanche for dog, the ideal name for a dog. Naru was originally named Ki, which means no in the tribe's language, but Myers felt she should be named for what she did, in this case, fight. It's impossible to name everyone involved, but educator and consultant Juanita Padafoni, language consultants Catherine Puanoff-Kit Briner and Guynar Comey, dialogue actor Marlon Nuani, research historian Jimmy Arterbury, and title sequence artist Nakona Burgess are all Comanche, and all consulted and worked on this movie. They did extensive amounts of historical research, studied customs and period-appropriate dialogue and sign language. The original script didn't include any horses, and it was Myers who insisted on having horses, that Comanche have always had horses, and they were added into the script. The original script was also planned to be filmed completely in Comanche. Even the initial script was headlined all in Comanche, but the studio would mandate it to be primarily English, with some Comanche and French. They did talk about doing A Hunt for Red October, where you start in Comanche and transition to English, but they couldn't make it work. Casting Naru was going to be the crux of this movie. Casting began in February 2020 before COVID took over the world and production was halted. The movie at this point was still called Skulls, but no one was aware anyone was making a Predator prequel. It was only in November 2020 the news leaked that Skulls was set within the Predator universe. In May 2021, Amber Midthunder was announced as the main star, who at that point was mostly known for her role as Carrie Loudermilk in Legion, which is a great underrated Marvel show, by the way, and her recurring role in Roswell, New Mexico. Midthunder is of Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota descent, and the movie would be filmed on Nakota land, which was obviously incredibly special to her personally. The cast was rounded out by other Indigenous people, including newcomer Dakota Beavers as Tabe, himself a descendant of Oke Awingay Pueblo, and his character would be reincarnated 300 years later as the character Billy Soul, played by Sonny Landham in the original 1987 Predator. Billy, being Native American, was also a key factor in choosing to have the Comanche lead this movie. Michelle Frush, who is Cree and has been in the acting business for 35 years, as Naru and Tabe's mother Aruka, and the best performer, Coco, the Carolina dog, as Sari. Coco is not a dog actor, but was adopted and trained specifically for this movie, which meant her performance was more of a natural dog performance. Sari ended up in more scenes than they'd initially planned because Coco was unpredictable and fun and just the bestest girl. Carolina dogs, or American dingoes, were known to roam freely and were mostly feral dogs before being domesticated. They were a rare breed of wild dog that followed the first humans to cross the Bering Strait 4,500 years ago. Trachtenberg wanted to cast a dog that would be period accurate, and Carolina dogs are direct descendants of those dogs. In November 2021, the name of the movie was revealed as Prey, and it was confirmed it would be released on Hulu and Disney Plus in mid-2022 internationally and would not have a wide cinema release. I'm going to be coming back to that as well. Now, there was a slight legal battle in April 2021 before filming started between original Predator creators James and John Thomas, who filed a lawsuit against Disney to reclaim the rights to the characters they created, with the brothers allegedly trying to stop Skulls, as it was then known, going into production, with them entitled to have the courts to issue a preliminary injunction on new Predator material until the conclusion of a trial. But it actually never went to trial because the Thomas brothers dropped the lawsuit and Disney ended up settling out of court in January 2022. And so principal photography on Prey began in June 2021 at the Stoney Nakoda Nation near Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Additional filming over the next several months took place in and around Calgary, including Moose Mountain and Elbow River. The movie was only shot outdoors and only during dawn and dusk, utilising all of the beautiful Calgary landscapes. But it meant chasing the light a lot of the time. Filming took place over 4 months, and they even had to ford a river to get to the set. The day before filming began, director Dan Trachtenberg and producer Jhane Myers, along with cast members, including Amber Midthunder, Dakota Beavers, Stormy Kipp and Stephanie Matthews, participated in a private pipe ceremony on the Stoney Nakoda Nation, with Indigenous leaders giving a blessing and granting permission to film on their ancestral land. Myers shared a land acknowledgement recognising and respecting the area where filming commenced. Quote, "The 20th Century Studios, the production and our parent company Walt Disney Studios would like to acknowledge that we have gathered on the ancestral lands of the Stoney Nakoda Nation, which are the bands of the Bears Paw First Nation, the Chiniki First Nation and the Wesley First Nation. We acknowledge them as the first peoples of this land on which our production cast and crew community proudly works and creates," unquote. The idea always was to respect the land on which they were filming, respect Comanche traditions and culture, respect the natural light and the natural world, and I love that so much love and respect went into a mid-budget big studio production like this, because it shows in the end product. Trachtenberg and Myers would work closely with costume designer Stephanie Porter and makeup department head Samantha Rumble to accurately portray the Comanche ways. A great deal of attention and detail went into the makeup on the principal characters' faces and bodies, as well as with every single piece of wardrobe, which in Indigenous cultures are described as regalia. What viewers see on screen isn't a fictionalized representation of the Comanche people, it's an authentic representation of the 1700s, from the face painting to the regalia to the weapons. The Comanche colours are black, red and white, which are earth pigments that are historically correct for the 1700s. The colours were produced from crushed rock, with flowers and grasses being used to make pastes, and while traditionally they were applied with bear grease, they matched the colours and came up with a consistency that was similar to bear grease. They also wanted it to look like something that these people had worn on their faces and bodies for days. They slept in it, ate in it, hunted in it, because there really wasn't a cleanse, tone and moisturise routine in 18th century Indigenous America. Indigenous actors also brought their own significant makeup designs from their own lineage, the designs that their own ancestors wore. The colour palettes for the wardrobes came from what would have been available in the Wichita Mountains in the 1700s to turn into colour pigment. They wanted to make sure that every colour worn was something that could be made from the earth, from rocks, from berries, even from duck poo, which actually resulted in a blue hue that could be used to dye material. For the character Naru, Porter needed something that was authentic to the period, but also practical for filming. Naru's costume is made from buckskin, which is basically deer leather, and it was given a traditional Comanche shape, so Midthunder was able to run, jump and fight. Producer Jhane Myers was also involved in the costuming, wanting it to be traditional or authentic, but also representative of the character's needs. Naru's twisted fringe was also traditional to the Comanche people. Naru even uses a traditional toothbrush in the movie, and it's this level of detail that astonishes me. These communities were innovative, thriving societies, and Hollywood just always depicted them as savages. Representation matters, but it's the quality and honesty of that representation that matters more. Tabe's costume was based on the last United States chief of the Comanches, Quanah Parker, who wore a hairpipe and a chest piece, and elements of that chest piece, which is on display in a museum in Oklahoma, were used to create Tabe's hairpipe and chest piece that he wears. War Chief Kahetu's costumes included the traditional black, red, and white, and a traditional war belt and buckskin with a decorative buffalo hunt scene painted onto it. It was decorated with faux ermine and weasel fur and faux horsehair. Decorative beans adorned his tribal robes, which came from Europe and were semi-precious and only used in the garments of high-ranking tribespeople. And the depictions of the Comanche tribe is a stark contrast between them and the French fur trappers. The Comanche people would use every part of an animal carcass for clothing, food, for embellishment, and other useful livelihood reasons. Nothing was wasted because it was considered disrespectful to the animal that had given its life. The fur trappers' costumes and look were intentionally dirty, and the idea that they would skin a herd of bison just for their pelts and leave everything else is the ultimate in disrespect to the native people. Because this is a movie that depicts all of nature's prey and predators, from the ant to the mouse and to the snake, from the rabbit to the wolf and the bear, from the Comanche to the French fur trappers to the Yautja. The cast went on a 4-week boot camp where they built up their cardio levels, learned stunts, choreographed fight scenes, practiced weaponry, and learned horse riding skills. And it also allowed the cast, particularly the native cast members, to bond before filming. The boot camp was led by stunt coordinator Stephen McMichael, fight coordinator JJ Park, and Indigenous tactics and movement coordinator Kevin Starblanket, who worked closely with the cast to incorporate Native and First Nations traditions. McMichael and Starblanket, along with Park, choreographed the different styles of fighting among the Comanche people, the French fur trappers, and the Predator based on their motivations. And for the Predator, Dan Trachtenberg went back to the original designers, Tom Woodruff Jr. and Alec Gillis, who were previously working at Stan Winston Studio where they designed the original creature, but were now heading up Amalgamated Dynamics, or Studio ADI. While this Yautja would be recognisable as a predator, he would also be of a slightly different species to the one we knew. He would be more creature-like, more alien, more of a threat, if that's even possible, and he would be a technologically advanced creature, but the technology would be less advanced than the 1987 Yautja. His mask would be made of bone, and he would hunt with less advanced weaponry. And just like Kevin Peter Hall, it would be a tall man under that costume. In the grand tradition of naming predators, just like the jungle predator and the city predator, this would be affectionately known as the feral predator, and he would be 300 years removed from the other guys. He would also have a much smaller head than the other predators too. Former professional basketball player turned actor Dane DiLiegro is 6'9" and 245 pounds, and he wouldn't just be in the suit, he'd be the motion capture reference actor and he'd do all the stunt work too. Prior to filming, he intensively researched the character, went to mime school to humanise the character, give him nuance and personality. He lost 25 pounds and spent months training in parkour, martial arts and strengthening his neck due to the new design of the Predator, which had a 15-pound animatronic head on top of his own head, forcing him to shoot every scene essentially blind. His head was basically in the neck of the creature, and his head was scanned to fit into the creature's specially elongated and muscular neck. In order for him to not look hunched on screen, because he couldn't stand upright, DiLiegro would do beast mode where he would throw his shoulders forward to avoid looking misproportioned. He would have to perform mostly from memory due to his lack of vision, as well as suffer with the extreme heat being in the suit would accentuate. Advancements in technology such as 3D sculpting and printing made the feral predator creation process more efficient than it was back in the 80s and 90s. Once the 3D designs were approved, those sculptures were printed, moulded and cast out of clay, along with his body, which contained the huge neck and shoulder muscles necessary to hide DiLiegro's head. But the traditional ways are often still the best ways, so the suit itself was cast in very much the same way as Stan Winston's original Predator suit was cast, using industry-standard foam latex with a variety of colours never before seen on a previous Predator. And while CG obviously would be used in the movie for some of the Predator's behaviour, the Predator's cloaking ability, as well as the various animals except for Coco the dog, the vast majority of the visual effects were practical, such as the animatronic head, which had 27 servo motors in each of the two hero heads, with more points of movement in the mandibles than any previous Predator. His weapons would also need to be cool-ass weapons, but also not make the Comanche look outnumbered with their bows, arrows, and spears. The team at ADI originally looked at the idea of a caveman or Neanderthal predator, but they seemed too inelegant, so they designed a crossbolt with laser-guided arrows, a shield that could cut through rock, as well as more grounded spear-type weapons, combining technology and bone into its gauntlets and its net ball. Throughout the visual effects for Prey, Tom Woodruff Jr. and Alec Gillis would pay tribute to Stan Winston, with Gillis saying, quote, "The spirit of Stan Winston was in this movie all through it. That's what we were trying to do. We were trying to bring what he and his team did so masterfully. We are here years later doing it because of his design. We don't take that lightly, and we don't make changes lightly either. We try to elicit the same feeling without it being exactly the same," unquote. Much of the history of the Comanche people and most indigenous tribes is passed down through the generations rather than recorded or documented. But the film's end title sequence features artwork depicting select moments in the story, which serve as an homage to the pictorial hide art typically painted on buffalo hides by Great Plains Native Americans to document historical stories. A number of award-winning Native American artists created the artwork, including Brent Leonard, Dallin Mabey, Nicole Hatfield Curtis, Jonathan Thunder, Sheridan McKnight, Sandra Akuma, and Nakona Burgess, which was then animated by Design Studio Filmograph. It shows an outline of the story with a little tidbit of 3 ships descending on the tribe. And the question of how the Predators got Raphael Adolini's gun to give it to Mike Harrigan at the end of Predator 2 remains unanswered. What doesn't remain unanswered, though, is the segue into this week's obligatory Keanu reference. And if you don't know what that is, it's where I link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves for no reason other than he is the best of men. And this was incredibly difficult. It was hard enough to try and link him to Predator. But Prey? This is a movie that he's literally got nothing to do with. So the very tedious link that I'm going to put out for this week's obligatory Keanu reference is that he starred in a 2015 movie called Knock Knock, where he was basically preyed upon by 2 young women. I mean, it's not really the same at all. It's so tenuous, it's unbelievable. However, that is the link. That is where I'm going to go. If you've not seen Knock Knock, it's okay. It's not the greatest thriller in the world, but it does its job. And it also is one of the very first appearances of a young Ana de Armas as well. So well worth watching it for her, but also worth watching for Keanu too. Now, there have been 3 previous composers on previous Predator films, and Sarah Schachner is the 4th composer to write music for the Predator franchise. She wrote the original score, and as opposed to previous films, this one features new original themes specially created and curated for the film, with a focus on Naru and her emotional journey and development. The score does not reference Alan Silvestri's themes from the first film at all. And since the movie is set in 18th century America, a number of historical string instruments, including a horsehead cello from Mongolia and a primitive violin imported from Kazakhstan, were used in the score. Pueblo musician and flautist Robert Mirabal was also featured in the score after Schachner came across him on YouTube searching for native instrumentalists. Much of this score was recorded remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic. Producer Jhane Myers screened Prey for various Comanche Nation departments before it was finished. They universally adored it, but what they loved most was that an unfinished film was being screened for them to watch while they still had an opportunity to make changes. The 20th Century Studios were more than willing to take their voices and opinions into account. One thing 20th Century Studios refused to budge on, though, was a full standard Comanche release. It had to be released primarily in English, but a Comanche dub would come. Prey premiered at San Diego Comic-Con on the 21st of July 2022 during an exclusive screening hosted by Collider and was released by 20th Century Studios as a Hulu original film on the 5th of August 2022 on Hulu in the US, Star Plus in Latin America, and Disney Plus everywhere else. But the question remains, why would a studio pass on a theatrical release if it had potential as a box office hit? So the official line is that Disney primarily utilised the film to demonstrate to viewers that Hulu was a place to have great cinematic experiences. Since Prey was a holdover before Disney bought Fox in 2019, the potential for post-theatrical streaming boosts was contractually limited. 20th Century Studios had an agreement with Warner Brothers that stated the film would eventually be available for streaming on HBO Max, or Max as it's now known, if it had been released in theatres. So it's likely that studio executives chose not to release a major franchise picture so that they would never have to release it on HBO Max, and instead it went directly to Hulu/Disney Plus. While it arguably deserves a theatrical release, there's a chance it probably wouldn't have been a big box office hit, especially if you look at the box office in 2022. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but would anyone who went to see Top Gun Maverick or Avatar: The Way of Water also chosen to see a Predator prequel? Now, probably not, but who knows, because it never happened. It was never given the chance. And the premiere it did have was attended by a predominantly native audience, which is nice to hear about, and obviously the movie went down incredibly well with that audience too. Prey became the most watched premiere across all films and TV series on Hulu in the US, as well as the most watched film premiere on Star in international markets and on Star Plus in Latin America. Prey broke barriers with its streaming release, but it also broke misconceptions about the limits of streaming. This was the rare streaming movie to also get a traditional home release from 20th Century Studios, being released on DVD, Blu-ray and Ultra HD Blu-ray in October 2023. Now, this was mostly due to fan demand, as well as what Dan Trachtenberg himself wanted for the movie, but it was also due to 20th Century Studios head Steve Aspel, who is a huge Alien and Predator fan, and as a fan of the franchise, he wanted it on physical media. Trachtenberg assembled a commentary team, including Amber Midthunder, because he loved watching DVD commentaries, and the disc ended up with over 2 hours of all new bonus features. And so we come to the Comanche dub, a first for a major motion picture to be dubbed into Comanche. Other movies have had subtitles for indigenous tribes, the Lakota in Dancing with Wolves as an example, but Jhane Myers noted that the subtitles were mistranslated, possibly down to misinterpretation, cost-cutting, or simply just not caring enough to produce authentic translations. She wanted to shift that paradigm for Prey. She oversaw the film's language efforts, working with Trachtenberg and writer Patrick Aison on the Comanche dialogue heard in the film's English language version, and shepherding the Comanche dub, the first of its kind, and its streaming release allowed for that Comanche dub to be a possibility on the day of release. And the full Comanche dub that had been denied by the studio initially, during filming they started injecting Comanche words and phrases into the script. When the dailies were getting sent back to the studio and the execs were looking at it, they were really liking what they were seeing and hearing. Close to the end of filming, they approached Jhane Myers for a whole Comanche dub. Luckily, the Comanche Nation has a really good language program, the Comanche Nation Language Department. Myers reached out to Guy Narcomi. He studies interactional dialogue, or how people talk to each other in casual, formal, cultural, or task-centered conversations. He also wrote the Comanche Dictionary. And while the post-production team was working on visual effects in March 2022, Myers and Narcomi took a rough cut to the Comanche Language Department, showed it to Cultural Preservation, the Tribal Council, the Comanche National Museum, and asked them for translation advice. To help the actors, none of whom spoke Comanche except for a few phrases, proficient Comanche speakers Guy Narcomi and Dr. Catherine Puenavkit-Briner from the language department recorded the male and female parts on language tracks for phonetic pronunciations. These tracks were then given to the primary cast, all of whom were contracted to have the first right of refusal in order to reprise their role if it's dubbed into another language, and all of them wanted to dub the Comanche. Each of them did 5 to 6 takes in a studio following the language tracks, and adding necessary emotion and nuance. In order to match up the new dialogue to the performances in the movie, and without the ability to re-record those performances, the team partnered with Pixelogic's dubbing department using software called VoiceQ, which enables efficient and accurate assessment of the original translated script. It looks at mouth movement, the position of a character on the screen, the frame count, time code, and a host of other variables to create lip-sync perfect script. The entire script adaptation took just 3.5 days using VoiceQ. Then the recording took a further 10 days using a mix of in-studio and remote recordings. They worked on this dub from April to July 2022 when they had to turn in the completed dub to Hulu. The final budget for Prey was $65 million, $18 million less than The Predator, which came out 4 years prior. And obviously, there is no box office takings for this movie because it never got released. Hopefully that'll change at some point in the future. But Prey is by far the most well-reviewed film in the whole franchise's history. We're talking almost unanimous acclaim, which is uncommon for a genre movie of any kind, much less the 5th installment in a long-running series. It received positive reviews from critics with praise for its action sequences, Midthunder's performance, cinematography, Trachtenberg's direction, and the indigenous casting, with many critics calling it the best Predator installment since the first film. It has a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes, with a consensus reading, the rare action thriller that spikes adrenaline without skimping on character development. Prey is a Predator sequel done right. It was even praised by previous Predator stars Jesse Ventura, who played Blaine in the original, and Bill Duke, who played Mac in the original. To cap it all off, Prey was nominated for 6 Emmys, including Outstanding Directing for a Limited or Anthology Series or Movie, Outstanding Writing for a Limited or Anthology Series or Movie, Outstanding Television Movie, Outstanding Music Composition for a Limited or Anthology Series, Movie or Special, Outstanding Picture Editing for a Limited or Anthology Series or Movie, winning an Emmy for Outstanding Sound Editing for a Limited or Anthology Series, Movie or Special. Dan Trachtenberg has confirmed he will be co-writing and directing a separate entry to the franchise called Badlands. Not much information has been disclosed other than it isn't going to be a straight sequel to Prey. Instead, it will take place in between the 18th and 20th centuries and follow a new female lead, who probably gets into some sort of conflict with Ayocha at some point. Elle Fanning has been in talks to star. A direct sequel to Prey is still being discussed, as is the participation of Amber Midthunder to reprise her role. And Prey seemed to be one of those movies that just came out of nowhere, just as we were getting over a global pandemic, and a total breath of fresh air to a franchise that had become stale over time. Whenever I cover a movie on this podcast, it's usually because I enjoy the movie and I'm fascinated by how they made it. Oftentimes I come away from covering a movie having a newfound respect for it. But for this movie feels like such a phenomenal achievement, such a personal journey, such a labour of love and respect for the indigenous people and lands that so many colonising countries, and I come from one of the worst ones, claim as their own. This not only takes that Predator lore, adds a bit of history to it, and repurposes it for a new generation. It's better than anything that came before because it's so honest and raw and unassuming. It is the best Predator movie by a mile because it's made by people who actually took the time to give us something different. As much as I love the original Predator in all its 80s bravado, and we would not have this movie without it, this movie is just so special. The underdog triumphing always will feel that way. Arnie wasn't an underdog. He was Arnold bloody Schwarzenegger. The landscapes here, the cinematography, this is a beautiful movie. The cinematographer here is Jeff Cutter. He also worked on The Boys and 10 Cloverfield Lane with Dan Trachtenberg. This movie is gorgeous and is so deserving of a big screen experience. And excuse the pun, but I am praying for Prey to one day get a cinema release because this movie really does deserve it. Having Comanche people behind the scenes, working on this movie, advising on it, undoubtedly makes it even more special and beloved. As a white person with very little previous knowledge on Comanche culture and traditions, this feels like a window to the past. That's exactly what movie making should be about. That a genre movie can be authentic to its time period and to a group of people. The levels of its authenticity, there are a few places online that dispute it, especially the role of women in Comanche tribal hierarchies. But overall, it's clear that a predominantly white person-headed studio and a white director and a white writer actually took the time to involve people who would know or know who to ask. We rely on stories from the past to be handed down. I wish all the time that my grandparents were still here. My granddad especially always loved to tell stories of his youth, his experiences during and after the war, but those stories are told to be passed down. We tell those stories to the kids in our family, my nieces and nephews, and hopefully they will pass them down. And this is a story that is tight, well-paced and engaging, as well as being as accurate as it possibly can be. And we can't let stories or experiences disappear. We need our media to be more representative. Now, don't get me wrong, there are dark parts in all of history. The Comanches weren't saints, but we need movies like this so underrepresented people can tell their stories and let them tell it in their languages, especially if those languages are dying out. And make it a commentary on colonialism too, as well as brutally pick off the white people one by one. It's about time they were the expendable bad guys. Colonists are just as much of an alien invader as the Yautja is. And unlike the first Predator, you don't need a bunch of macho, masculine, muscular dudes facing off against a predator. No trained military elites, no explosions or big guns. There's so much more to this movie than what's on the surface. Just like Naru, just like Amber Midthunder. Never underestimate women. You think that she's not a hunter, that she's not a threat. That's what makes her dangerous. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Prey. And as always, thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you do want to get in touch with me and you want to talk to me about Prey, please do. I am on social media. I am at Verbal Diorama. You can find me, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. And if you do find me on social media, make sure you like posts and share posts because that might help someone else find this podcast as well. And they might also want to talk to me about Prey. You can also leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. That also helps with visibility too. Or you can just tell a friend or family member about this podcast. And if you like this episode on Prey, you might also like the previous episodes that have Yautja in them. Alien vs. Predator and Aliens vs. Predator Requiem. Yes, I did that episode first. That is episode 127 of this podcast. And obviously the previous episode to this one, episode 267 on Predator. There are also episodes on the Alien movies as well if you are interested. However, let's just stick with the Predators for this recommendation. As always, give me feedback on my recommendations. Let me know what you think, especially if you listen to those episodes. The next episode, I'm going to keep it fairly brief because it is the birthday episode. It is an annual tradition for me to do an episode that's released on my birthday, and it's usually a movie that means a lot to me personally. You could argue that a lot of movies that I feature on this podcast mean a lot to me personally. However, this one is especially special because the next episode of this podcast was the movie that introduced me to the works of Bong Joon-ho. This was the gateway movie that opened up the works of Bong Joon-ho, not just to me, but I think to many Western audiences in general, because it was the first English language movie that Bong Joon-ho did. And it is one of the best movies set on a train, apart from Speed, obviously. It's also a career best for Chris Evans, too. Bear in mind at the time, he was Captain America. And so this was a complete diversion for him and for his career. But it is a phenomenal movie. And this year's birthday episode is on the movie Snowpiercer, a movie that was never actually given a release here in the UK, which, just like Prey, is an absolute travesty. So please join me next episode for the birthday episode of this podcast, where I'm going to be looking into the history and legacy of Snowpiercer. Now, as I always say, this podcast is free, and it always will be free. There are no sponsors, no ads for this podcast because I don't like them. But because of that, and because I need to keep subscriptions going and hosting going, I have an amazing group of people who support this podcast. And if you have some spare change and you would like to join those people, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. You could go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip if you feel like this podcast is giving you some value. Or you can sign up to a Patreon subscription, which is a regular monthly donation at verbaldiorama.com/Patreon. And you can join the amazing patrons of Verbal Diorama. They are Sade, Claudia, Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, So, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip M, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Russell, Philip K, and welcome brand new patron Adam to the Verbal Diorama Patreon collective. Now, Adam has been an absolute joy over the last couple of months. He actually ended up using verbaldiorama.com/tips and actually ended up tipping me twice. And because he's tipped me twice, imagine my surprise when it turned out that he'd signed up for the Patreon as well. Huge thank you, Adam. Welcome. I am so happy to have you here. And thank you so much for all of the coffee that you've bought me and for the licky licks that you've bought Evie with the tips that you gave us. And honestly, I'm so grateful to all these amazing people. They really do help Verbal Diorama to continue to get better, to get new software, to get new subscriptions. Honestly, I could not do this podcast without all of those amazing people. So thank you so much for all of your support. I really, truly appreciate it. Now, if you don't have social media and you want to get in touch with me another way, you could send me an email, verbaldiorama@gmail.com, or you can go to my website, verbaldiorama.com, and you can fill out the little contact form on there. You can also find bits that I do over at filmstories.co.uk. You can find copies of the magazines that I write for and also articles online as well. And finally,
Heads up!
This is as far as you go. No more. This is it.
bye.